Bermuda today is a holiday destination for many Americans trying to beat the summer heat aboard a cruise ship, or less prominently as a center for offshore financial services. But long before tourism was an industry and the wealthy needed a safe pair of isolated hands, Bermuda was the key to the survival of the very first American colonists, and a springboard for the wider colonization of North America, later becoming the axis that connected the West Indies and Canada to the rest of the British Empire, as well as a fortress that protected vital convoys from German U-boats during the World Wars. The history of Bermuda is longer than I expected. Let's get into it. Bermuda is an isolated archipelago 665 miles southeast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, consisting of 181 wind-deposited limestone islands sitting atop an extinct hotspot volcano formed some 34 million years ago, rising from the Atlantic's abyssal depths. Bermuda is part of the wider New England seamounts, a chain of over 20 extinct volcanic mountains, known as seamounts so long as they are underwater, with the White Mountains in New Hampshire and Maine formed by the same hotspot over 100 million years ago. Bermuda sits just off the path of the Gulf Stream, giving it a borderline humid subtropical-tropical climate, with relatively warm winters having record lows in the lower 40s with no frosts or freezes on record. Bermuda also has a hot, but not oppressively so, summer, reaching average temperatures in the 80s with record highs of only 93 degrees in the dog days of August. Despite being much higher in latitude, Bermuda's Köppen climate classification is about half an index higher than that of the Florida Keys. Bermuda never had a native human population before the European Age of Sail, with the largest terrestrial animals native to the islands being the Bermuda skink, with recent genetic analysis concluding the diamondback terrapin is also native to the islands. The only mammals that managed to find their way to the islands on their own were 5 species of bats also found in America. The islands were rich in bird life, with the ground-nesting Bermuda petrel, locally known as the cajo for its eerie cry, one of Bermuda's 12 suspected native bird species, one that was thought to have gone extinct in the 1620s until 18 nesting pairs were discovered in 1951, with conservationists working hard to re-establish the birds on Bermuda. Bermuda was primarily covered in a unique biome dominated by Bermuda cedar, a member of the juniper family closely related to the common and much faster growing American species of eastern red cedar. So close, in fact, one of the biggest current threats to modern Bermuda cedars is hybridization with its more common cousin. The coastal and inter-island areas of Bermuda also hosted dense red and black mangrove swamps, but the loss of the primary Bermuda cedar forests led to a sharp decline in all native plant and animal species, seeing the extinction of the island's native bee and cicada species, among likely many others wiped out before anyone who could find them made their way to Bermuda. The first mentions of Bermuda currently known are attested in the work of the Castilian colonial administrator, writer, and historian Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdez, who sailed under the Spanish navigator Juan de Bermudez. Bermudez first spotted the islands in 1505 while running his regular supply route to Hispaniola, as he had since at least 1498, appearing on the map of Peter Martyr of Angleria, the first print map of the Caribbean, made in 1511. Oviedo and Bermudez got near the island on a return journey to Spain in 1515, but, along with most seafarers, never got all that close to the islands, fearing its many reefs. especially during hurricane season, and the frightful sounds made by the island's cajos. Instead, the Spanish treated it like most islands they didn't explicitly want, dropping off pigs should any lost ship need to make an emergency resupply adventure to the suspected demon-infested island. Due to the island's position, many sailing back from the Caribbean had to pass north with the Gulf Stream to catch the prevailing westerlies going towards Europe, in opposition to the easterlies, or trade winds that you would take to get to the Americas in the first place, which have their mixing point south of Bermuda in sort of a triangle between South America and Africa, where all the hurricanes are made. A miscalculation in navigation or unexpected weather found many sailors wrecked on or about Bermuda, leading to a phenomenon famously known as the Bermuda Triangle, with even smaller modern ships and aircraft not immune to the power of the Atlantic. The first known shipwreck survivors on Bermuda was the crew of a Portuguese slave ship returning to Europe that smashed into a reef in the early summer of 1543, as attested by Ovidio. The crew carved the letters of P and R on Portuguese rock, formerly known as Spanish rock, on the main island, before making their way to Hispaniola, where they were interviewed by Ovidio in the fall. In 1603, Captain Diego Ramirez landed on the island at Spanish Point, with members of his crew to explore the main island after their galleon had become damaged in a storm, charting the islands and noting signs of shipwreck survivors who were even growing tobacco in small gardens, before finishing the repairs on their ship and leaving. In 1609, Sir George Somers, as Admiral of the Virginia Company, a private corporation tasked with the colonization of the New World, set sail aboard the Virginia Company's new flagship, the Sea Venture. The ship was a 300-ton second-hand North Sea trade galleon, at the head of a fleet of 9 other ships, carrying supplies and 214 settlers to the beleaguered Jamestown colony. The convoy encountered a tropical storm or hurricane on July 24th. The fleet fought the storm, but was ultimately scattered. The crew and passengers of the Sea Venture bailed water out of the leaking vessel for 3 days, the storm having forced the caulking out from between the planks. With 9 feet of seawater in the doomed ship's hold, and the crew completely exhausted, the Sea Venture spotted Bermuda, catching itself between a gap in the reef just off the northeast end of the islands. The passengers and crew rode to what is now known as St. George's Island, landing on the sandy beach of Gates Bay, on the northern tip of Bermuda. As the weeks turned into months, the settlers became aware of the dire straits the Virginia colony was in, and refused to leave Bermuda, arguing that the hurricane that led them here was God's will, and that they were free from their contracts, opting to remain on the island full of birds, fish, and feral pigs. The governor of Jamestown, Sir Thomas Gates, had other ideas, and the hopes of the settlers for freedom in this paradise were dashed by the governor, transforming their fledgling settlement into a tropical prison labor camp. The leaders of the expedition did not do this out of malice, having wider agreements to the Virginia Company and colony they could not ignore. News that the settlers you sent out were starving should probably light a fire under anyone, and a little bit of a hurricane's not going to get you out of a contract to save those people. To that end, the crew set about building 2 ships to bring aid to Jamestown, as it quickly became apparent that the Sea Venture was a total loss. Though a few stragglers from the fleet did make it to the starving Virginia colony, the Sea Venture was carrying the lion's share of the cargo desperately needed by the colonists. Luckily, 2 of the expedition were experienced shipbuilders, Admiral Somers himself and Captain James Davis, who constructed the first English boat in the New World, the 30-ton pinnace Virginia, at the failed Popham colony in Maine, which was sailing with this flotilla when the Sea Venture was wrecked. Over the next 9 months, Summers and Davis, along with the ship's carpenter, directed the rebellious settlers and crew to construct 2 full-rigged pinnaces from locally available timber and what could be scavenged from the Sea Venture. At first, only the larger ship, Deliverance, was planned, but it was quickly realized that another ship, the Patience, would be needed to carry all the castaways and enough supplies for Jamestown. During construction, the Sea Venture's longboat was rigged with a sail and sent to find Virginia, either the colony or the ship, but was lost and none of the crew ever heard from again regardless. Deliverance and Patience left Bermuda on May 10, 1610, leaving behind Christopher Carter and Edward Waters, the two being the leaders of the Stay in Bermuda faction, as it were. Waters was left intentionally as he had murdered fellow sailor Edward Samuel with a shovel during a fight. Waters had been tied to a tree while the governor figured between the rope or a firing squad, and had either escaped of his own accord or been allowed to escape by the settlers. Carter simply fled into the woods while the 2 ships were being loaded, joining Waters on Smith's Island. The relief ships reached Jamestown on the 23rd, finding 60 of the expected 500 Jamestown settlers who had eaten vermin, boiled leather, and even resorted to cannibalism. The meager Bermuda fleet was able to ease the starving times until a military expedition fleet led by the Lord Delaware arrived on June 10th. Admiral Summers set out again for Bermuda shortly after the arrival of Lord Delaware, not wanting to fall under the Earl's command, and to bring more food to Jamestown. Shortly after reaching Bermuda, Summers suffered some sort of exhaustion from his experience in Virginia and died on November 9th. Instead of taking pork back to Virginia, Summers' nephew, Matthew Summers, eager to receive his inheritance and get the jump on his elder brother, loaded his uncle into a cask of whiskey and headed for England, stopping to bury the admiral at their hometown of Lyme Regis in Dorset. Upon reaching London, Summers petitioned the Virginia Company to settle the islands, claiming that the colony would be profitable from pearls and ambergris. The company had their charter extended to Bermuda by Parliament on March 12, 1612, with settlers arriving shortly after, christening Bermuda the Somers Isles in honor of their fallen admiral. These 60 initial settlers were led by Sir Richard Moore, the first appointed governor of Bermuda, reoccupying and completing the settlement on St. George's Island started by the Sea Venture settlers, with the town of St. George being the longest continually occupied British settlement in North America. These new settlers were mostly indentured tenant farmers who were there to support whatever viable industry the island would develop. The first attempt at fostering an industry on Bermuda was by the Somers Islands Company, a spin-off of the Virginia Company formed after the Virginia Company tried to offload the not profitable enough islands on King James in 1614. The Somers Islands Company was dedicated to the plantation or settlement of the islands, importing 2 slaves, 1 Native American and 1 African, both specialists in pearl diving, who quickly discovered there were no pearls on Bermuda, though collecting ambergris did turn the colony a modest profit in its early days. Soon, though, Captain John Rolfe at Jamestown would begin cultivating a sweeter strain of tobacco he had smuggled out of Spanish Trinidad, with Bermuda quickly planting Smith's tobacco in their fields, becoming a dominant producer in the early tobacco trade. The company's first priority was to defend its bounty and began constructing a series of fortifications, ranging from towers and batteries to redoubts and full forts. The second priority of the island was a matter of some debate. The people on Bermuda, like their Virginian counterparts, were desperate to cultivate as much tobacco on their property as possible. the colony needing more profit than ambergris could provide to keep the company's shareholders interested, neglecting food crops in favor of fishing and hunting. The second governor, Daniel Tucker, Cape merchant or financial agent specializing in trade, and former treasurer of Jamestown, as well as one of the few survivors of the starving time, had a differing opinion. Taking charge in 1616, Tucker focused instead on instilling the strict discipline he cultivated in himself while starving in Virginia on the Bermudans, much to their chagrin, as well as prioritizing self-sufficiency in food production over tobacco cash crops, much to the consternation of his fellow shareholders. To this end, Tucker would import new food crops, as well as between 50 and 100 slaves over the next 3 years. Tucker's rule was underlined by the tensions between the hard-nosed survivor and the Bermudans, accustomed to plenty and tropical temperatures, with Tucker hanging a settler for deriding his decisions within days of arriving on Bermuda, highlighting his opinion that death was always closer than the colonists thought. Tucker would be forced out in 1619 after a scandal involving stolen surplus lands and a mansion built with public funds, being replaced by privateer Nathaniel Butler, who continued fortifying the islands. Butler left public affairs to the new representative government, the House of Assembly, beating out of St. Peter's Church before the purpose-built State House was finished later in 1620. The Bermudan government consisted of the elected single-house parliament, though the real power was held by the appointed Council of Bermuda, which sat atop the elected government as a de facto upper house, consisting of the wealthy and connected members of Bermudan society, with the appropriate connections necessary to the Summer Islands Company and later the Crown. Butler would incidentally lead to the creation of the Bermuda style of rigging, when Dutch shipbuilder Jacob Jacobsen wrecked on Bermuda and under the governor's employ swiftly established himself as the foremost shipbuilder on the islands. Jacobsen brought with him advanced Dutch hull designs and sail technologies that were becoming fashionable in Royal Dutch sailing circles. The Bermuda cedar turned out to be an ideal wood for these sleek and nimble designs. Jacobsen built over 100 Bermuda rigs in 3 years. His competition could only grumble and emulate his designs, becoming a cornerstone of Bermudan shipbuilding. Bermuda-rigged sails would remain a favorite style for working ships, notably sloops and schooners in the pre-steam age, and fast yachts even to this day. Bermuda continued to import slaves, primarily Africans from the West Indies and southern colonies, but also taking Native Americans captured in the many conflicts on the mainland. By 1626, the first laws against slaves were made, outlawing the ability for slaves to buy, sell, or even barter for tobacco without the consent of their master. Bermuda led Virginia in tobacco production until 1625, but it was clear in the run-up that due to the effects on the soil in relation to the limited space for agriculture on the islands, that tobacco was not a long-term solution. In combination with a decline in Bermuda's whaling numbers, the Bermudans were facing an economic crisis. To remedy this, many on the island began diversifying their crops, including the importation of corn, potatoes, and various fruit trees, as well as livestock, including cattle and chickens. Though many of those seeking to make a fortune in tobacco cared little for the long-term health of the island soil and resisted agricultural diversification, with tobacco remaining a principal export and medium of exchange on the island, while under the operation of the Somers Islands Company. Starting in the 1630s, those on Bermuda growing food crops were vindicated when overproduction in Virginia, combined with shipping problems stemming from the many active European wars, saw tobacco prices crash, beginning a century of tobacco market instability, with food crops becoming an increasingly profitable alternative for struggling planters wanting off King Tobacco's wild ride. In this era as well, Bermuda reached its maximum population for the first time, with new English immigrants becoming rare and Bermuda seeing its first in a trend of emigrants leaving the island. Most Bermudans would either leave for newer colonial holdings in the Caribbean and American colonies, or return to Britain for education, usually funded by the family plantation, until finding employment in the upper echelons of English and colonial society. Between 1620 and 1640, 1,200 Bermudans emigrated, despite the population increase to 4,000, a trend that would grow as opportunities in the empire increased and the islands were developed. Bermuda was in a relatively unique political position when compared to the other North American colonies, who were pretty much politically segregated on purpose. The Bermudans, on the other hand, were made up of whoever had enough money to invest at the time. These investors ran the political gamut, consisting of middle-class merchants of Puritan persuasion, as well as less radical members of the Church of England, shoulder to shoulder with wealthy nobles and landed aristocracy deeply connected to the crown, putting the islands in a precarious position when political instability struck. As the rising tensions between the crown and parliament came to a head, corporate colonies like Virginia, Bermuda, Antigua, and Barbados were openly and visibly loyalist, with Bermuda expelling their parliamentarian and Puritan inhabitants, with Captain William Sayle organizing the Eleutherian adventures and taking a small group of about 70 initial Bermudans to the Bahamas. The adventurers struggled to prosper, seeking aid from Virginia and New England, as more Bermudans were expelled to the islands. When the Stuarts were fully ousted and Cromwell's protectorate reigned over England and its colonies, the loyal colonies were punished with the Act for prohibiting trade with Barbados, Virginia, Bermuda, and Antigua, passed by the Rump Parliament in 1650. The act punished all who failed to swear allegiance to the Commonwealth, and those who aided the Stuart princes Charles and James in fleeing England, also making royalist ships fair game for privateering, with many cavaliers fleeing to Virginia as their princes fled to France. Soon thereafter, the governor of the Somers Islands Company, the Earl of Dorset, was replaced with a Puritan parliamentarian, the Earl of Warwick, and Sayle, along with his other adventurers, were allowed to return to Bermuda. Politics in Bermuda became messy, though the islanders came to an accord with Cromwell and Parliament. The Bermudans were never happy with the Roundhead governors, with few lasting more than a year, and in some cases having a triumvirate or even electing their own governor. Though by 1650, things seemed to have calmed down, with Captain Josias Forster serving as governor nearly until the Restoration, with William Sayle taking it back before and remaining after the Restoration. Following the restoration of the Stuarts with the coronation of King Charles II on April 23, 1661, the Somers Islands Company was purged of parliamentarians, with pro-Stuart figures retrenching themselves in the London corporate scene, and the islands were recognized along with Virginia for their loyalty during the interregnum. Bermuda's parliament managed to fly under the radar and survive the colonial retributions that followed, remaining the longest-sitting legislative body in the world. In this era, Bermuda's economy swiftly moved away from agriculture as Bermudan tobacco and food crops could not compete with the growing American export market, with seafaring, fishing, and trading dominating the economy, resulting in a middle class of merchants becoming ascendant in Bermudan society. Bermuda had largely stopped importing slaves with the reduction in agriculture, save for the occasional Native American or African taken by privateers. Penal transportees, though a practice more associated with Australia, were taken primarily out of Newgate and Bridewell prisons, as well as Scots and Irish rabble-rousers who were captured in the following civil wars, the Irish being a main culprit in stirring up the many Bermudan slave revolts. With the coming of Bermuda as a maritime hub, the majority of new indentures were of a professional nature. Shipwrights, smiths, carpenters, and the like were in ever higher demand as more ships and infrastructure to support them was needed. The end of large-scale agriculture in Bermuda meant a surplus of Bermudan workers were in desperate need of new farms to work on, and it just so happened that new opportunities were about to open up in America. In 1663, the newly restored King Charles II granted 6 lords proprietors, led by the Earl of Shaftesbury, a large title to all lands from the southern border of the Virginia colony at 36 degrees north to 31 degrees north, a claim his father had given out before the Civil War that never materialized. To secure this, the proprietors sent a colonial expedition of Bermudans led by the now 80-year-old Captain William Sale to the new Carolina colony, founding Charleston on the west bank of the Ashley River, a few miles northwest of the present city, becoming the first governor of the Carolina colony. With the rise of Bermuda's maritime industries, the already prevalent activity of privateering had exploded, with many of the remaining Bermudans engaged in farming leaving to capture lucrative prizes should war be declared. Bermuda lacked a garrison, relying on the islanders for defense. As such, Bermudans were exempt from impressment, making Bermuda a legal haven for privateers seeking to keep and maintain a full crew. The Bermudans also took over the failed Puritan colony of Providence Island off the coast of Nicaragua, turning it into a wretched hive of scum and villainy from which pirates attacked the Spanish treasure ships and Portuguese traders, with the King of Spain and Portugal Philip IV and III sending an expedition to finally capture the island and expel the pirates, with the island of Providencia now owned by Colombia. Bermuda's tradition of emigration would once again contribute to the island's troubles. As emigrants left, they took their advanced maritime knowledge to the growing port cities of America, and Bermuda would become less of a necessary stop as ships improved. In the decades leading up to the American Revolution, Bermudans subsisted on harvesting exotic woods from Central America, trading with the various tribes of the American Southeast, and by fishing the Grand Bank cod fisheries, needing to make enough money to import food for most months out of the year. Bermudans also made a tidy profit from salt, squabbling with the Bahamas over Salt Cay and Grand Turk Island in the modern Turks and Caicos Islands, producing a sea salt of exceptional quality, taste, and versatility. By 1770, though, Virginia was building more ships than Bermuda, signaling a familiar trend for the island's economy. Bermudan privateers gave the American colonies no end of grief during the Revolution, though many of the aforementioned Bermudan merchants were closely tied to and, in some cases, on the side of the colonies. The vast majority remained steadfastly loyal to Britain and raided American shipping incessantly. The Bermudans would follow Royal Navy ships around American ports and clean up any stragglers trying to get into harbor. They were particularly thick around Boston. When Patriot ships attempted to catch the Bermudan privateers, the sleek Bermuda sloops sailed 2 or 3 feet for every one of ours, easily evading the heavier white oak New England-built ships. The only successful operation against Bermuda was led by 2 Bermudans who had settled in South Carolina and were swayed by the Patriot cause. The Tucker family had been prominent on Bermuda since 1616 when Captain Daniel Tucker was made governor, with the latest head of the family, the wealthy merchant Henry of the Grove, with his son, also Henry but not of the Grove, who was elected president of the Council of Bermuda early in 1675. The Tucker family was well connected by blood and contracts to the American Southern colonies, and Henry Jr. was sent to the Continental Congress meeting in July of 1775. But the Bermudans refused to join the rebellion, despite the island's reliance on American food exports, seeking an exemption from Congress's embargo on Loyalist colonies. This exemption came in the form of a clandestine clause in the Embargo Declaration. The Continentals were willing to sell food to be smuggled into Bermuda in exchange for military equipment. Faced with the possibility of a famine, the leadership of Bermuda were willing to cast a blind eye. To this end, Henry Tucker of the Grove and his son coordinated with Benjamin Franklin to allow Henry's younger sons in South Carolina, St. George Tucker and Thomas Tucker, to sail to the fortress of St. George's Island and steal the substantial gunpowder reserves. Bermuda being the main base of operations for the Royal Navy as the North American station, and among the most fortified places in British North America. The younger brothers coordinated 3 ships to leave Charleston, Philadelphia, and Newport, which simultaneously reached Bermuda on August 14th, swiping 100 barrels of gunpowder, about 10,000 pounds, while the governor slept. While not being a war-changing amount of ammunition, the powder was enough to keep the rebels afloat until more secure supply lines with Britain's rivals, namely France and the Dutch, could be established, and domestic production increased. Though the Tucker family suffered no direct reprisals or local political damage due to importing food, the British retaliated against the Bermudans for this treason, sending the HMS Scorpion to strip the island's defenses of their cannons and any remaining ammunition, though contraband still moved through the island's busy harbors to the rebellious colonies. Bermuda remained a busy Royal Navy and privateering base through the war, though by the end of the war the British had gotten control back on the island, stamping out the smuggling and forcing Tucker's faction back into line. After the signing of the Treaty of Paris, Bermuda became the only hub connecting Britain's remaining Caribbean and Canadian colonies, seeing massive investment through the War of 1812, when Bermuda was declared to be an imperial fortress alongside Malta, Gibraltar, and Halifax. Bermuda would again house rebellious prisoners, this time South African Boers, called Bitter Enders, guerrillas and holdouts from the Second Boer War who refused to swear fealty to Edward VII, captured and deemed too dangerous to be left to foment rebellion in South Africa. Bermuda hosted a total of 5,000 of these prisoners of war, the most infamous being Captain Fritz Jobert Duquesne, who escaped to the United States in 1902 and was caught sabotaging ships during the First World War, later being arrested by the FBI during the Second World War for operating the largest German spy ring in the United States. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Bermuda became a vacation destination for wealthy American, Canadian, and British tourists. Leveraging the excellent weather, advertised as cooler than any American resort on the East Coast, presence of dapper Royal Navy men who had an open invitation to the organized events, dances, and functions, as well as the noteworthy population of unmarried Bermudan women, combined to make Bermuda a premier holiday destination. Advertisements in newspapers targeted a higher class of tourists to take any of the luxury cruise liners that service Bermuda, supplementing and eventually overtaking the lucrative early-season vegetable and Easter lily trade that kept the islands afloat in the early steamship age. Following the implementation of Prohibition in the United States, Bermudans would join others from the Caribbean and Canada to form what was known as Rum Row, a legal phenomenon where rows of ships would anchor themselves, first 3, later increased to 12 miles from shore in international waters, serving rum runners sailing to and from the American East Coast. As many as 60 ships occupied New Jersey's Rum Row, the busiest section on the eastern seaboard, with the many secluded inlets, bays, and rivers importing by far the largest amount of smuggled alcohol, led by Atlantic City, ferried from Rum Row in souped-up small boats to be sold in cities like Philadelphia and New York by criminal organizations like the Mafia. Bermuda's prime location and maritime culture made it an ideal base for serving this market. During the First World War, Bermuda organized the convoys that transported goods from Canada and the United States to Europe. Many of the opulent cruise liners that once carried fresh vegetables and tourists were turned over to the Royal Navy to be transformed into weapons of war, attempting to deliver vital goods to Britain while also avoiding the highly effective German U-boats. Many Bermudan men joined the Canadians and fought in the trenches of France, suffering the characteristically high death and casualty toll of trench warfare. In addition to the many Bermudan sailors lost to German submarines, Bermuda was not spared the loss of an entire generation of young men. During the Second World War, Bermuda resumed its position as a center for rallying convoys across the Atlantic in the face of the improved German U-boats. Bermuda also became a center of air transportation. The first plane to land in Bermuda was a Stinton Detroiter seaplane in 1930. The famous weather no longer much of an obstacle for the great liners and warships, but very much a problem for early planes until the invention and refinement of radar and meteorology. Lack of need restricted Bermuda's air access to only seaplanes, but during the Second World War, the United States became highly interested in developing Bermuda's potential as an airbase. The United States secured a 99-year lease for an air and navy base as part of the straightforward destroyers for bases deal, a precursor to Lend-Lease, in which the United States transferred 50 surplus American destroyers to the Royal Navy for land in Newfoundland and the British West Indies. Though Bermuda was not explicitly part of the deal, having been thrown in as a bit of a pot sweetener for the Americans, the British were all too eager to hand defensive Bermuda off to the neutral Americans and redeploy Bermuda's garrison elsewhere. In 1940, the Navy constructed the Naval Operating Base on Darrell's Island in the Great Sound, before moving to a new base to the west in Eli's Harbor on Tucker's and Morgan's Islands, which had been leveled and enlarged into a singular peninsula connected to the main island. These bases serviced large seaplanes, pulling them onto the base's tarmac pad and into hangars for more invasive maintenance until seaplane use was discontinued by the U.S. Navy in 1965. In 1943, the U.S. Army Air Force constructed Kindley Field, primarily on St. David's and Longbird's Island, again leveling smaller islands and landfilling them into a larger island necessary for a runway. As a side note, it was during this work that 2 scale insect species were unintentionally introduced to the island, beginning the cedar blight, killing 99%, upwards of 8 million Bermuda cedars. Though the survivors seem to have resisted the blight, the loss of the island's famous timbers is still felt today both ecologically and culturally. The Army Air Force and Royal Air Force operated together until the end of the war, when the RAF returned their facilities back to Bermuda's civil government, having only borrowed them for the war, leaving the United States as the sole military power on the island, with Fort Bell housing a defensive Army garrison until 1948. Following the war, the now independent Air Force upgraded Kindley Field to Kindley Air Force Base for use as a refueling station for transatlantic flights, occasionally basing spy planes there during events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1970, Kindley AFB was transferred to the Navy and renamed Naval Air Station Bermuda, operating submarine hunters and maritime surveillance planes until the development of longer-range nuclear attack subs made range irrelevant to a Soviet submarine's ability to obliterate a city, thus rendering submarine hunters flying around off the eastern seaboard irrelevant in kind. The United States decommissioned the base and returned it to the Bermudan government in 1995. Bermuda would spend a significant amount of money refurbishing the aging Navy base for use as L.F. Wade International Airport, which in 2024 handled just over 200,000 passengers, over 130,000 of which were explicitly tourists, with 2023 the first year Bermuda's first locally established airline, Bermuda Air, operated. The majority of tourists, however, still prefer to arrive by cruise, though air used to be more popular. In 2005, the cruise eclipsed the plane and remains dominant, with 535,000 tourists arriving in Bermuda aboard cruise ships in 2024. Financially, Bermuda leverages its relative political isolation and economic reliance on America, changing from the Bermuda pound to the Bermuda dollar, pegged to the US dollar in 1970, despite being a British overseas territory. Bermuda, as well as other British overseas territories and small states, have created tax loopholes to exploit American and European tax codes, becoming a haven for law firms and big corporations, with tricks like the Bermuda black hole synergizing with the double Irish arrangement, providing a convenient place for global profits to simply disappear from the view of the IRS. With Bermuda being the fifth largest offshore financial sink, per a Nature 2017 article uncovering offshore financial centers by Javier Garcia Bernardo et al. Of Amsterdam University, though recent tax code developments in the United States may see the many black holes related to leprechaun economics close. Bermuda has a long history of, as we have seen, improvising, adapting, and overcoming all obstacles that come in their way, always seeming to figure it out. And at the end of the day, they're on a tropical island in the Atlantic and I'm not. So I think Bermuda and the Bermudans, whatever happens, will be just fine. If you like this video and want to see more like it, liking the video and subscribing to Mid-Atlantic Chronicles goes a long way. Thank you for watching.